What if everything you were taught about the rise of human civilization was wrong? Not slightly off, not missing a few dates or discoveries, but deliberately inverted, like a mirror cracked and rearranged, so that up becomes down, truth becomes fiction, and memory becomes myth. What if history, as you know, was never meant to preserve the truth, but to conceal it? Not because you couldn't handle it, but if you knew the truth, you would no longer be controllable. This isn't a theory, it's a recognition. A slow, shattering realization begins as a whisper in the back of your mind and grows louder every time you read an ancient text that feels strangely familiar. Every time you walk among the ruins of a past that feels more like home than any city you've ever known. Because deep inside you, something has always known. We are not the pinnacle of human evolution. We are the descendants of something far greater than we've forgotten. You feel it, don't you? That quiet unrest when you look at the stars, that pulse of knowing when you stand barefoot on the earth, that undeniable instinct that there's more to you, more to this world, more to where we came from and why we are here. And you're right. You were never meant to believe that humanity crawled out of the mud, stumbled through ignorance, and only recently became civilized. That version of history was engineered for obedience, not awakening. It was constructed to keep you looking forward in a straight line, never daring to look back and ask, what was lost? What was taken? And why? Because once you ask those questions, the whole story begins to collapse. It begins with Atlantis, not the fairy tale, not the bedtime story about a sunken city, but the real Atlantis, a civilization so advanced it operated on principles we're only now beginning to rediscover in quantum physics, vibrational medicine, and sacred geometry. A society that mapped the Earth's energy grids, worked with crystals not as ornaments, but as frequency modulators, and saw consciousness not as a side effect of the brain, but as the fundamental architecture of reality itself. This was not a myth. This was mastery. And it was erased, not by accident, not by natural disaster, but by design. Because if you knew what they knew, if you understood how they lived, how they healed, how they educated their children, how they accessed dimensions of awareness beyond time and space, you would never again be satisfied with the life the modern world offers you. You would stop playing small. You would stop believing in limitation, and you would begin to remember who you truly are. But memory is dangerous to those who profit from forgetting. So instead, they gave you a version of the past that flattens everything into linear progress. They told you that ancient people were primitive, that myths were fiction, and that belief in anything unseen was superstition. They buried the truth beneath layers of ridicule and reductionism, so that if you ever stumbled upon it, you'd doubt your instincts before daring to believe it might be real. Atlantis wasn't just erased from the record, it was buried in your subconscious. And now, it's waking up. The signs are everywhere. In the uncanny similarities between ancient cultures that supposedly never met, Egyptians and Mayans, Sumerians and Hindus, Aboriginal Australians and Native Americans, all telling the same stories, building the same structures, mapping the same stars. They were not echoing each other. They were echoing something older, a civilization that came before all of them, a blueprint from which all other myths were drawn. And that civilization didn't vanish. It withdrew, waiting for a time when the human spirit would once again be strong enough to carry its truth. That time is now. You feel it in the surge of synchronicities, in the dreams you can't explain, in the sudden emotional memories that don't belong to this life. You hear it in the resonance of certain words, symbols, and places that call to you like a frequency you forgot how to interpret, but never stopped sensing. This is not fantasy. This is resonance. It's what happens when something ancient within you begins to wake up. And you're not alone. Across the world, others are beginning to remember, not in the form of facts, but in flashes of insight, deep intuitions, spontaneous knowings. They're remembering how to feel energy, how to trust the inner compass that was silenced by education and socialization, how to listen to the whispers beneath the noise. You're not discovering Atlantis. You're becoming what it left behind. Atlantis never intended to preserve its truth in monuments or manuscripts. It preserved it in consciousness, in the very structure of human awareness, in you. And now, that truth is rising again. Not in textbooks, but in people. People like Ariamontes, a field anthropologist stationed in the highlands of Peru, who found geometric patterns etched into stone older than the Incan Empire, patterns that matched sacred symbols found in Egypt, India, and Tibet. People like Ezra Delon, a physicist in Switzerland, who discovered that specific harmonic frequencies could activate memory stored in quartz crystals, and that those crystals, when encoded correctly, began to emit electromagnetic patterns mimicking brainwave activity. They're not imagining things, they're remembering. They're putting together pieces of a puzzle hidden in plain sight, a puzzle buried in architecture, myth, vibration, geometry, and dream. A puzzle designed not to be solved with logic, but with resonance. And as you hear these words, you too are remembering. Your cells are listening. Your bones are responding. Because the truth isn't something you believe. It's something you feel before you understand. And when you feel it, there's no going back. The mirror is broken now. The illusion has cracked. The false story is collapsing. What remains is the invitation. Not to believe, but to explore. Not to follow, but to remember. Not to be taught, but to be activated. Because this is not just a story about Atlantis. It's a story about you. About who you were before the forgetting. About the technology encoded in your consciousness. About the power that awakens when you stop asking for permission and start listening to your own knowing. If you feel the pull of this message, don't ignore it. If something inside you just whispered, yes, it's time. This is only the beginning. In the next chapters, we'll reveal how Atlantis operated, not as a mythic utopia, but as a living civilization of energetic mastery. We'll explore their sacred science, their teachings, their technology, and how those teachings are returning now, encoded in the hearts of those ready to remember. If you're one of them, welcome home. You're not late. You were simply waiting for the right signal. And this is it. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to this channel and become part of something ancient returning through modern skin. Every like, share, and comment helps awaken someone else who's been waiting for this call. Your support gives us the strength to continue uncovering what was buried, not in the ground, but in consciousness. It was never written in words, not in the ancient temples, not in the stone tablets buried beneath deserts or submerged beneath oceans. The real teachings of Atlantis were encoded in something older than language, etched into the fabric of reality itself. Geometry, light, frequency, intention. That was the language of the stars, and the Atlanteans spoke it fluently. But we forgot how to listen. After the fall, all that remained were fragments, symbols mistaken for decoration, patterns dismissed as coincidence, sounds reduced to superstition. But what was once the highest form of science became mythology. What was once the operating system of an awakened world became mere ornament on our temples, stained glass in our churches, or inked across our skin without knowing what we carry. Ezra DeLong knew the difference. He had spent years studying vibrational harmonics and crystalline structures at a research lab near Lake Geneva. His reputation in theoretical physics was solid until he published a paper claiming that quartz could not only store electromagnetic patterns, but could be tuned to specific emotional frequencies. The academic world recoiled. His funding disappeared. But Ezra didn't stop. He knew what he had found wasn't new. It was old. Older than memory. Older than time. He wasn't discovering. He was decoding. When he met Aria Montes at the Santorini conference, it was more of a recognition than an introduction. She showed him the geometric overlays she had uncovered in the Andean highlands. Impossible, ancient alignments between pre-Incan architecture and star maps of the Pleiades. He showed her a series of cymatic images, patterns formed by sound frequencies vibrating through quartz dust. What startled them both was not the similarity. It was the match. One of Aria's uncovered carvings from Cusco, a 12-pointed star formed by intersecting spirals, was identical to a cymatic shape produced by a frequency Ezra had recorded from a singing bowl tuned to 432 hertz. Neither of them said anything for a while. There was no need. They had both touched the same thread. They had found the language. The Atlanteans did not build monuments to worship. They built machines of resonance, structures that responded to thought, aligned with Earth's energy grids, and communicated with consciousness itself. Every angle, every proportion, every layer of material had a purpose. It was not architecture, it was code. And the code was still active. Sacred geometry was not sacred because it was spiritual. It was sacred because it was functional, a universal architecture through which life, energy, and consciousness flowed. The flower of life, the golden ratio, the Sri Yantra. These were not spiritual decorations. They were blueprints for manipulating space, time, and awareness. In the Atlantean worldview, symbols were not representations. They were gateways. A triangle wasn't just a shape. It was a frequency stabilizer. A spiral wasn't an artistic motif. It was a model of energetic expansion. A hexagon wasn't pretty. It was efficient, echoing in everything from beehives to planetary orbital dynamics. Aria recalled a chamber deep beneath a collapsed site near Lake Titicaca. The walls were lined with hexagonal tiles made of a composite mineral she had never seen before, one that reacted to her touch with subtle vibrations. Each tile bore a raised symbol. When she ran her hand across them, different tones emanated from the walls, gentle, harmonic, but undeniably alive. It was as if the structure was tuning itself to her presence. The deeper they went, the more they understood. The Atlanteans were not using sound and symbol as spiritual metaphors. They were using them as tools. Their technology was vibrational, their science sensorial. Their understanding of reality was not built on abstraction, but on direct, resonant experience. Crystals were central to this. They weren't passive objects, they were intelligent matter. Ezra discovered that certain crystalline structures could absorb, store, and emit frequencies specific to emotional states. When exposed to focused intention and vocal tone, they lit up slightly, but perceptibly, especially when placed in sacred geometrical arrays. This was more than fascinating. It was revolutionary, because it meant that the Atlanteans were not just preserving information in crystals, they were storing consciousness itself. Not as static data, but as living, responsive awareness, capable of transmitting, amplifying, and even interacting with the human field. The symbols were not just on the walls, they were embedded into the crystal lattice itself. Ezra and Arya developed a working theory that specific sound frequencies, when paired with precise visual geometry, could unlock dormant knowledge within both human and crystalline memory. In other words, the ancient knowledge was never lost. It was just encoded beyond the reach of logic, waiting for resonance. And this is why the teachings were never passed through speech. They were never meant to be spoken. They were meant to be activated through frequency, breath, light, and intention. This realization opened a floodgate. They began collecting symbols from cultures across the globe: Dogon star glyphs, Vedic yantras, Mayan stelae, Norse runes, and overlaying them with cymatic patterns generated by specific tones. Time and time again, the match was undeniable. Ancient symbols from unrelated civilizations were producing the same vibrational geometries. These were not artistic coincidences. They were linguistic constructs, the same language, the same science, a universal code. But perhaps the most startling discovery came not from an ancient ruin, but from within Ezra himself. He began to dream in symbols, not vague or surreal, but geometric, layers of shape and light forming complex sequences that pulsed with intention. In these dreams, he wasn't observing. He was participating, singing, toning, aligning. It was as if he had once known this language, and now it was returning, one dream at a time. He shared the dreams with Arya. She recognized several of the patterns from carvings she had found in northern Chile, symbols no one could translate. Until now, these dreams were not dreams. They were downloads, or rather, recall, memory embedded in frequency, surfacing through the subconscious because the conscious mind was too limited to understand it in waking life. The Atlanteans knew this too, which is why many of their teachings were preserved not in writing, but in dream temples, chambers where initiates would be exposed to harmonic tones while they slept, allowing memory to surface without resistance. These weren't rituals, they were technologies of remembrance. Modern science is just beginning to scratch the surface of this. We know now that sound affects water, that frequency affects biology, that light patterns can stimulate dormant areas of the brain. But the Atlanteans didn't need proof. They lived the proof. They didn't observe reality. They orchestrated it. Ezra summarized it best. We use technology to extend our senses. They used consciousness to extend reality. And the key to it all, every structure, every crystal, every tone, was coherence. Not controlled, not force, coherence. The harmonic resonance between internal state and external form. When your breath, your thought, your intention, your environment all move in harmony, reality responds differently. Arya described it as tuning the body to the song of the universe. And when you're in tune, you don't manipulate life. You participate in it. The Atlantean blueprint wasn't just a map of lost knowledge. It was a living interface, a bridge between energy and matter, symbol and self, star and soul. And that bridge is rebuilding itself now, not in labs or universities, but in you. Because the language of the stars never stopped speaking. We just forgot how to listen. But now, you'll remember. And in the remembering, you're not just decoding the past, you're reactivating the future. Because this was never about learning Atlantis. It was always about becoming what it remembered you to be. The Atlanteans didn't teach children how to survive in the world. They taught them how to shape it. Long before alphabets, grades, and graduation caps, before the world decided that intelligence meant memorizing information, there existed a way of learning that was not aimed at making citizens or workers, but at activating beings of awareness. Education, in its truest form, was never about conformity. It was about sovereignty. To be sovereign did not mean to rule others. It meant to rule within, to know the terrain of your inner world so deeply that no external system could define your reality for you. It meant becoming fluent in the language of energy, emotion, intention, and frequency, because the Atlanteans understood that the real curriculum of life was vibrational. Ezra Dillon once called it the lost code of self-mastery. But Aria Montes had seen it with her own eyes, etched into murals buried beneath the highlands of Peru, faint but unmistakable. In one chamber, she found concentric circles of stone, each embedded with glowing crystal inlays. It wasn't a temple, it was a school, not one of facts and formulas, but of feeling, intuition, and transmission. It was designed to train the consciousness, not the intellect. In Atlantis, the child was never treated as an empty vessel to be filled. The child was seen as a being already carrying memory not of books, but of light. And so education was not about implantation, it was about uncovering. The role of the guide, never called teacher, was to recognize the soul within the student and activate what was already there, encoded in the subtle body like seeds waiting for spring. Children began their initiation into awareness, not with numbers or grammar, but with silence. They learned to still their breath, to listen, not with ears, but with their field. At age 5, they entered the first ring, a circular chamber where they sat in quiet communion with others, absorbing the resonance of the space. No words were spoken. They were taught to sense the emotional landscape of the group, to detect the unspoken ripple of thought, to distinguish their own energy from another's. It was a kind of energetic literacy that the modern world has almost entirely lost. At 7, they entered the second ring, the School of Coherence. Here, they were taught how to align thought with feeling, how to stabilize their frequency regardless of chaos around them. They learned that the world did not respond to what they said, but to what they held in their field. Intention was not a wish, it was a force. Aria had translated fragments from what was believed to be the Atlantean Codex of inner training. It described a child standing before a bowl of water, learning to change the vibration of the water simply by aligning breath, focus, and emotion. Not as parlor trick, as proof of principle. Consciousness shaped reality. And so the student's first task was always to know themselves. Ezra later confirmed the scientific echo of this when he measured the electromagnetic field of individuals trained in breathwork and coherent intention. The readings were not subtle. In states of harmony, the body became a transmitter, not metaphorically, but measurably. The heart's rhythm smoothed. Brainwave activity synchronized across hemispheres. Emotions stabilized into patterns that mirrored geometric harmony. This was no longer esoterica. It was emerging science, long after Atlantis had already mastered it. But sovereignty was not given freely. It had to be earned. At the age of 13, students entered the rite of alignment. For this, they descended into a chamber known as the Echo Room. Here, no guides accompanied them. They were left alone, not in darkness, but in deep resonance. A tone, personalized to their vibrational signature, was played in cycles. Over hours, sometimes days, the student attuned to the sound until their field no longer resisted. The result was always the same. At a certain point, the tone and the self became one. The illusion of separation dissolved. And what emerged was not a child, but a sovereign frequency, one that no longer needed validation, no longer sought approval, and no longer mistook fear for wisdom. Aria once wrote in her field journal, "They did not produce students. They produced stewards. Each child became a keeper of frequency, a guardian of their reality, and a living node within a collective web of consciousness." There were no grades, no competition, no punishments. The only failure was forgetfulness, to forget who you were, to forget how to feel your own field, to forget the sacred agreement that life was a co-creative act between your vibration and the cosmos. And so every lesson, every movement, every chant, every breath, every symbol was designed to reinforce remembrance. There were also the dream schools, special sanctuaries where children were taught to become lucid in sleep, to navigate the realms beyond the body. They did not dream passively. They traveled. They learned to decode the symbolic language of the subconscious and retrieve insight. These children would wake with full memory of visions, conversations, even teachings received from what the Atlanteans called the Council of Harmonics, archetypal intelligences operating beyond space-time. Ezra was captivated by these accounts. He had once dismissed dreams as biochemical residue, but after beginning resonance breathwork and exposure to geometric fields, he began having what he called instructional visions. He would awaken with precise mathematical concepts in his mind, ideas he hadn't studied, yet could sketch perfectly. When Aria compared them to diagrams found in submerged Atlantean structures, the match was undeniable. The dreams were not dreams, they were lessons. It was clear now. Consciousness was the curriculum, and frequency was the method. Atlantis had built an entire model of education that treated the soul, not the personality, as the student. And it worked. They raised beings who were not dependent on systems, but who were the systems, beacons of clarity in a world of flux. They did not need to be governed, because they had already learned to govern their own inner terrain. This is what the modern world fears most, not rebellion, but inner sovereignty. A being who feels deeply, thinks independently, sees without filter, and lives from alignment is ungovernable, not because they fight authority, but because they no longer need it. That is why such an education system was buried, not because it was mystical, but because it was dangerous to those who benefit from confusion, distraction, and division. But it's returning now, in whispers, in alternative models of learning, in children who feel too much and know too deeply to be labeled, in adults who are tired of information and long for activation, in breath circles, in sound baths, in intuitive awakenings that defy explanation. It is not about recreating Atlantis. It is about remembering what Atlantis once made possible, an Earth filled with sovereign beings who no longer wait to be told who they are. Ezra once said, "The greatest gift of education is not knowledge, it's the capacity to trust your knowing." And that is the path we now walk. You were not born to be a number, a title, or a job description. You were born to be a frequency, and frequencies cannot be managed, they can only be met. This is the new education, not external instruction, but internal activation. And it begins the moment you stop looking outward for truth and begin feeling the curriculum that was always written within you. There are truths so vast, so ancient, that they don't live in books. They live in the body, in the trembling of your hands when you stand before certain stones, in the tightness in your chest when you hear a story that feels impossible familiar, in the tears that come for no reason, in dreams that don't feel like dreams at all. You were never meant to remember them with your mind. You were meant to feel them. This is the truth Atlantis carried, not as history, but as frequency, not as doctrine, but as memory. And memory, when unclaimed, becomes pain. For Aria Montes, this realization didn't come through excavation or artifact. It came through grief. She had been studying a small, weather-worn statue unearthed near Lake Titicaca. Its face was androgynous, its hands open to the sky. Nothing about it should have been unusual. But when she held it, something cracked open. Not in the stone, but in herself. Images flooded her mind, not imagined, but remembered. A wide hall filled with light. Women and men dressed in robes of white and gold, standing around a circular platform made of crystal. A chant, low and slow, that filled her with a longing she could not explain. And then, collapse. Not just of the hall, but of something within her. She dropped the statue. She wept for hours. That night, she dreamed of fire falling from the sky, of waters rising, of people running. Some escaping, others choosing to stay behind to protect something sacred. She awoke shaking, not afraid, but full, as if a part of her that had been silent for lifetimes had finally spoken. She didn't need to know whether it was true by academic standards. She felt it, and that was enough. Ezra Delon had seen the same pattern in his work with trauma survivors. He had long believed, like most scientists, that memory lived in the brain. But after working with breathwork and harmonic sound frequencies, he began to suspect otherwise. There were moments when a tone, a vibration, even a scent could evoke memories too specific, too visceral to be imagined. Not just personal memories. Sometimes the memories were collective, ancestral, even planetary. He worked with a woman named Maren, a military veteran who had lost all feeling in her hands after witnessing unspeakable violence. Traditional therapy had done little, but during a harmonic session, using a quartz array tuned to her heart frequency, her palms began to warm. She cried, not because she was in pain, but because she could suddenly remember holding life, not death. She recalled tending to others with sound and touch in a time far older than her current life. She remembered herself not as broken, but as whole. The Atlanteans knew this terrain well. They mapped the body not only as a biological system, but as a field of layered memory. Each organ, each joint, each cell carried echoes, not just of your childhood, but of other lives, other timelines, ancestral patterns, even moments etched into the planetary grid itself. What we call trauma, they called distorted resonance, a memory caught in a feedback loop, seeking release. Pain wasn't the enemy, it was a messenger. And when listened to with reverence, it opened gateways not only to healing, but to transformation. In the texts Aria found beneath the ruins of a submerged site near Malta, there were instructions, not medical, not therapeutic, but vibrational. Practices to transmute emotional residue into harmonic alignment, a kind of emotional alchemy. The instructions described water as a memory amplifier, breath as a harmonizer, and sound as the scalpel that could cut through illusion. The process was not about fixing, it was about reclaiming. The Atlanteans had entire temples devoted to this. They weren't hospitals, they were resonance chambers, pools lined with reflective minerals, domes designed to amplify intention, crystal arrays calibrated to respond to specific frequencies of emotion. When a person entered these spaces, they weren't treated, they were tuned. Their story was not analyzed, it was sung. Modern medicine still sees emotion as secondary, as intangible. But in Atlantis, emotion was structured. It was the connective tissue between consciousness and form. Joy expanded the field. Grief deepened it. Anger revealed where boundaries had collapsed. Fear indicated where memory had fragmented. Each emotion had a purpose, a signature, a tone, and when brought into harmony, the result wasn't merely healing, it was evolution. Ezra theorized that the most advanced Atlantean technologies weren't devices at all, but emotional frequencies embedded into architecture, objects, and even language. He found that certain words, spoken in specific tones, could induce altered states of awareness more reliably than any substance. Not because of what the words meant intellectually, but because of the resonance they carried. Language wasn't about communication, it was about activation, and that activation extended beyond the personal. In Atlantis, healing was never an isolated experience, because individual pain was seen as collective imbalance. When one person healed, they recalibrated the grid. When one being remembered, it sent a ripple across timelines, across bloodlines, across dimensions. This was not poetic thinking. It was the very framework of their civilization. And it is that framework we are now remembering. Today, we're taught to disconnect, to bury our pain, to move on without understanding. But what if your pain isn't holding you back? What if it's holding a map? A key to an origin story long hidden beneath centuries of noise. You don't need to remember the details of a past life to feel its imprint. You don't need to recall Atlantis in vivid dreams to sense that you've walked those halls before. The memory doesn't come all at once. It comes in pulses, through scent, through emotion. The way your body tenses when you walk into a room that holds old energy. Through the soft weeping that escapes your lips when a certain tone or image strikes a chord you cannot name. That's memory, not of story, but of state. And that memory lives in you not to haunt you, but to guide you home. Arya and Ezra began integrating these insights into their work. They hosted a private gathering at an energy node in Crete, a place once believed to be a sanctuary of resonance. There, 10 people came together in silence, laying their hands on ancient stones, allowing emotion to surface without judgment. No one gave advice. No one explained anything. They simply listened to their own field and to each other. What happened that night was not catharsis. It was convergence. As each person dropped deeper into their own reclamation, the air itself thickened. A warmth filled the chamber. One participant said it felt like being held by something older than time. Another heard a song, not with her ears but in her bones. And one, eyes wide with tears, simply said, "We've been here before. All of us." The veil had thinned. The memory had arrived. Not as a concept, but as truth vibrating in the body. Atlantis is not just something we lost. It is something that lives beneath our wounds. And when we approach those wounds with reverence, not shame, not fear, we find not damage, but data. Not weakness, but remembrance. Your grief holds the signature of the healer. Your anger holds the fire of the protector. Your confusion holds the seed of a deeper intelligence waiting to realign. And when you allow yourself to feel it, not to explain it, but to be with it, you become the very thing they tried to erase. You become a memory awakened. Not myth, but medicine. Because healing was never about forgetting what hurt. It was about remembering what was always true beneath it. And that truth is not fragile. It is indestructible. It is what survived the fall. It is what waits beneath the rubble. It is what sings through you, even now. And when you are finally ready to hear it, the story changes. Because you are no longer the one being healed, you are the one remembering how to heal. And that changes everything. You cannot unknow what your soul has remembered. once the veil lifts, even for a moment, the world will never look the same again. And perhaps that's the point. Not to escape the illusion, but to see through it. To walk within it, fully awake, no longer mistaking shadows for substance. This is the quiet truth Ariamontes had come to understand, not through evidence, but through embodiment. The journey she had begun as an archaeologist, searching for signs of lost civilizations, had become something else, entirely. The ruins she had once studied now lived within her, not as structures but as states of being. The language of Atlantis was no longer etched into stone or hidden beneath soil. It was rising in her breath, her choices, her silence. It wasn't enough to learn what was lost. She had to become it. Ezra Delon had arrived at the same realization from an entirely different path. As a scientist, he had always sought clarity through quantifiable results. He had measured fields, mapped frequencies, and decoded the hidden geometry of sound and intention. But something had shifted. There was a point beyond which the data no longer led outward, but inward. A threshold where logic dissolved into something wordless. A knowing so total it could not be proven, only lived. He stopped asking if Atlantis was real in the way history books demanded. He began asking if it was real in the way silence speaks. Together, Aria and Ezra stood at a convergence point, not geographical, but vibrational. It was never about a single site or a single discovery. It was about coherence, the moment when all the fragments, all the inner echoes, all the unspoken truths formed a singular pulse in the body that said, "This is it. This is what I came here to remember." They met again beneath the ancient stones of Stonehenge, not by plan but by pull, a pull that had also drawn 7 others from around the world. None of them had been invited, yet all arrived within hours of each other, as if answering a call older than language. A musician from Kyoto, a healer from Ethiopia, a mathematician from Norway. Each carried a different key, a different note in a symphony waiting to be remembered. No one spoke much that day. They didn't need to. They stood in a circle between the stones, facing inward, eyes closed. Not to pray, but to align. Not to worship, but to listen. And what they heard was not sound, but memory. The slow, spiraling hum of something ancient waking beneath the earth and within their bones. The air shifted. Not in temperature, but in texture. It became thick with presence, soft with recognition. Time bent, or perhaps dissolved. For a few minutes, or perhaps a few eternities, they were no longer 9 individuals. They were in one field, one breath, one remembering. And then it passed. No fireworks, no visions, just stillness. But in that stillness, something permanent had rearranged. Each of them left that circle different. Not enlightened, not elevated, but embodied. What had once been theory, story, or symbol was now blood, muscle, and voice. They didn't need to teach. They didn't need to speak. They only needed to be. Because the final Atlantean teaching is not something you can write down. It is you. The Atlanteans never intended to preserve their legacy in books or temples. They preserved it in frequency, in the very field of human consciousness. They knew that the most sacred truths were not to be broadcast to the many, but carried by the few, until such time as remembrance became possible again. That time has come, and the invitation is clear. Not to consume more information, not to collect more truths, but to become the vibration of what you've remembered. To walk through the world not as a seeker, but as a signal. To speak, move, touch, and choose as one who carries a living blueprint inside their breath. You will not be understood by everyone, Some will think you've lost yourself, but that's only because they have not yet remembered who they are. Your path is not to convince. Your path is to emanate. You are no longer here to follow teachings. You are here to become one. Ezra began leaving his research unpatented, freely shared, no longer concerned with recognition. He said, "If knowledge can be owned, it isn't real." Arya stopped publishing papers and began leading silent retreats where people didn't learn. They recalled. Their lives became the living proof, not because they claimed to know more, but because their presence made others feel more of themselves. This is the true Atlantean way. The pyramid was never meant to be a monument. It was a metaphor. Each level, each chamber, each alignment, an invitation to rise within, not vertically, but inwardly, until you remember that the apex was never above you. It was within. You are not ascending toward something. You are returning to something you never left, only forgot. This remembrance is not a destination. It is a practice, a way of walking, breathing, choosing. It is how you hold your gaze in a moment of silence, how you listen when someone speaks from their wound, how you create beauty without reason, how you stop asking for permission, how you carry your pain with poetry, not apology, how you remember that being alive is not an accident, but an ancient agreement renewed with every breath. You are the scroll, you are the temple, you are the crystal archive, and your life is the codex now. Not because it's perfect, but because it is coherent. The true power of remembrance is not what it gives you, but what it strips away. The need to be right, the urge to be seen, the fear of being alone. Because once you remember who you are, the silence is no longer empty. It is full of every life, every teaching, every tone that has ever passed through you. And then, something remarkable happens. You stop waiting for a new age to arrive. You stop seeking a teacher, a savior, a sign. You realize it's already here. It always was. You are the return of Atlantis. Not the city, the state, the song. And every time you choose coherence over conflict, alignment over fear, stillness over noise, you make it more real. For yourself, for the field, for everyone who forgot. This is not the end of the journey. It is the moment it becomes yours. Because the final initiation is not given. It is chosen when you no longer seek to remember, but begin to live as the one who never truly forgot. Atlantis was never just a myth. It was never about a sunken continent, lost technologies, or forgotten temples. Atlantis was, and still is, a frequency, a living memory encoded not in ruins, but in consciousness. Through the journey of Arya Montes and Ezra Delon, we followed a path of unraveling, from the false mirror of history to the sacred blueprint hidden in symbols, frequencies, and the silent codes of the soul. We explored how ancient education awakened inner sovereignty, how emotional healing reclaimed deep truths, and how remembrance is not knowledge, but embodiment. You are not simply learning about Atlantis. You are what Atlantis left behind to be remembered through. The final teaching was never in stone. It was always alive within you. And now, as you begin to align your breath, thoughts, and presence with that truth, you don't just awaken your own path. You become a mirror for others. You don't need to chase something external to become whole. You already carry the blueprint. All that's left is to live it. How can you apply this? By treating your inner life as a sacred space. By becoming present with your emotions, trusting your intuitive signals, and making daily choices from alignment rather than fear. The Atlantean frequency returns not through discovery, but through the quiet revolution of coherent individuals, remembering who they truly are. Now, a question for you. Which one do you believe creates the most powerful shift in the world? A. Learning more information. B. Embodying what you already know. Type A or B in the comments below and share why you chose it. Let's open this space to deeper perspectives. What did this journey awaken in you? What part resonated most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to learn from your experience. And if you felt this message stir something inside you, subscribe to this channel and become part of the growing field of remembrance. Your support fuels the next transmission. This is just the beginning.